So just to give you a little bit background on our presenter this evening, we are welcoming KnowAtom. Founded in 2006, KnowAtom has developed one of the first full-year grade-level specific curriculum and hands-on material programs aligned to next-generation science standards. KnowAtom focuses on what matters, bringing students and teachers together to be scientists and engineers every day in the classroom. This year, KnowAtom will equip classrooms for more than 1 million hours of hands-on STEM learning from grades 1 through 8. KnowAtom focuses on skills and experiences that matter most for developing and sustaining student engagement and STEM proficiency, as measured by state standardized test scores. Students and teachers using KnowAtoms in their classroom have gone on to win national STEM competitions, including those from Disney, Toshiba, and Simons. KnowAtom's curriculum has been recognized globally for sustainable education impact in an award given by Jeffrey Immelt, CEO of GE. And in 2014, KnowAtom was invited to join the STEM Education Working Group of the Clinton Global Initiative America. Today, our presenter from KnowAtom is Francis Vigeant, who is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of KnowAtom. Vigeant has taught science, engineering, and mathematics to kindergarten, all the way up through 12th grade students in a variety of learning environments, ranging from college prep and honors classroom to self-contained, team-taught, and inclusion settings. His focus on scientific and engineering process, pedagogy, and practice has helped schools become leaders in science education based on common assessment programs. As the STEM specialist, his school in New Hampshire consistently ranked in the top 5 schools in the state for science on the New England Common Assessment Program. Vigeant's achievements have been recognized by the American Federation of Teachers publication, The Advocate, in which he was profiled as an up-and-coming educational innovator. He has been a guest presenter to the National Science Teachers Association National Conference, Massachusetts Association of Science Teachers, and Massachusetts Technology Education Engineering Collaborative. Vigeant serves on several STEM-related boards focused on creating opportunities for students and teachers from traditionally underserved communities. So as you can see, we have a great deal of expertise coming at you. We are welcoming both First Lego League and Junior First Lego League coaches and participants this evening, as well as some folks from KnowAtom's circle. And without further ado, I'd like to turn everything over to Francis.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening or afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. We're going to get started right off, and as people sort of join in, there will be a recording available later, and we will send a follow-up to that with the link. So jumping straight in, our agenda this evening was previously published when you signed up, simply looking at where these next generation science standards are coming from, how they're changing, how the transition will affect your school or district, as well as the relationship between NGSS, Common Core ELA, and math. We'll wrap up with talking about some opportunities like first in KnowAtom, how we can use these NGSS skills to enhance what's going on in the classroom, as well as give students that opportunity to be an engineer during the day and after school. And we'll have question and answer in addition to the questions that you're going to be presenting on the right side of your screen throughout the program. We'll be answering those at the end. So without further ado, let's jump right in. And of course, we're talking about next generation science standards, and when people hear the word standards, they tend to freak out and think about dwelling on the intricacies of the standards. But this webinar is really about the next generation science standards and how they're moving us forward in new and positive ways. And if we're going to be talking about standards, it makes sense to sort of start right off thinking about where the standards come from, and when we're talking about next generation science standards, what that actually is. So if you look at this chart, right at the top, federal guidance, the next generation science standards were and really are federal guidance for the states. You see each state sets its own state-level policy standards, and those are really laws that teachers who are licensed in that state have to follow. That's essentially, when you are licensed, that's your job. So if you're a first STEM coach and a professional and this whole education thing's kind of new to you, that's where the standards come from. Next generation science standards were developed as a collaboration, and so what's happening is that at the state level, already 14 states have adopted sort of this federal level guidance, which consists of standards or performance expectations as their state level policy. So that's why everybody is now saying, oh, we need to teach next generation science standards. It's because they've been adopted by the law in their state. Once those standards are adopted by the state level Department of Education, there is local level decision making that goes on. And so that's where your particular district or regional district, if it's not just a single town or city, decides on the programming that they are going to put in place to achieve the goals of those policy standards set by the state. The district makes that decision. The schools then have to implement. And so that's where it transfers from, say, a superintendent to a principal. The principal's job is now to implement those standards using the program that the superintendent or the school board or school committee has chosen. And that's where it reaches down to the level of teachers and students here. The principal sets the priorities for the building and how that implementation will take place, and the teachers carry that out, creating the environment in their classroom, assigning whatever particular tasks, and so on and so forth. And the trend more and more as communities, educators, after-school programs, and parents are all coming together around the education of children, what's going on in the school day is actually extending to after school. We call them wraparound zone initiatives and other programs sort of like this that are trying to take the same skills that are being implemented at the school level and are coming all the way down from this federal level in the classroom and take them deeper and further after school so that students get essentially the maximum time on learning. So that's a little too much time maybe there on standards, but so that we're all on the same page, that's where they're coming from, and that's what they mean. Why next generation science standards? Well, essentially it's all about recalibration. At the time the call went out for next generation science standards, the standards at a national level had not been reviewed for 15 years. And so what was happening was there had been so many advances in STEM as well as education research, even charter schools, things that had been piloted in non-charters as well as charters. This growing body of knowledge had accumulated, and the nation had been calling for more STEM literate workforce at the same time. So the federal STEM strategy has a primary focus on improving K-12 STEM literacy, and NGSS has sort of set out to recalibrate what exists across all the different states to something that's a little bit more contemporary as well as reflective of our national STEM workforce needs. Why the call? Here's some data from 2011. The call went out really in 2010. In 2011, essentially the statistics were coming back that students emerging from high school were less than 50% proficient in math and science in terms of their ability to do college-level coursework. At the same time, 80% of the new jobs created in the next decade were anticipated to require STEM knowledge and skills. So when you lump that on top of all of the baby boomers who would be retiring, there was a skills gap of around 1 million folks that was potentially emerging. Essentially, why this matters: students aren't ready for the college-level coursework. And then, of course, job training programs for those who are not even going into a bachelor's level program. Another key thing to point out there is that about 4% of the workforce are STEM professionals, but within President Obama's federal STEM strategy, it points out that that 4% has a disproportionate effect on job creation for the other 96%. And so, again, as we're in a sort of a knowledge-based economy or in that transition, and depending on what area you're in of the country, it's a major workforce push. So on the left-hand side here, you see the origins of NGSS. So Representative Frank Wolf from Virginia, so if you're calling in from Virginia tonight, Frank Wolf reached out to the National Science Foundation in 2010, and they commissioned this committee of the National Research Council to pull together this recommendation, Successful K-12 STEM Education, which established the foundation of the next generation science standards, or really the framework for what a next generation K-12 STEM education should be. So once that committee came together, they published this report. That then led to the next generation science standards being developed through a committee process led by Achieve. And the next generation science standards really established performance expectations for students, sort of grade level by grade level, and taking into account what had already been put in place through Common Core ELA and Common Core Math. And this is the major shift that's in place now. What emerged in the frameworks as well as the next generation science standards is this definition of effective STEM instruction. As part of the National Research Council's work, this new definition emerged where students need to actually be experienced and practicing science, technology, engineering, and math in the classroom. So when you think of science now, it's really integrating all of these disciplines, but in a practice-oriented fashion in the classroom. So students are now being scientists and engineers, not just merely learning about them. What NGSS aims to accomplish is equipping students to think scientifically. So what does it mean that students are equipped to think scientifically? I like to think about it as this example I saw of a student or a child who was somebody's student, wasn't my student, standing on a dock. And I watched this little guy, who was probably about 8 years old, and he was fishing. And he would cast his line out and reel it back, and no fish. And he'd cast the line out in the same spot and reel it back, no fish. And he'd cast the line out, reel it back, no fish. And he'd do this over and over and over again for about half an hour. I watched him in the distance, casting his line, reeling it back as quickly as he could, no fish. He wasn't thinking scientifically. This little guy wasn't thinking scientifically, because if he was, he would have cast the line out, reeled it back, no fish, and then asked himself the question, why no fish? Is it the speed that I reeled it in? Let's test that. Was it the type of bait that I used? Let's change it. Let's test that. Perhaps it's where I'm casting my line. Let's test that. So the goal is not, with NGSS, the goal is not that every student will emerge a scientist or engineer, that we will now have 100% of students going to college and taking STEM degrees, and we have suddenly go from 4% to 100% of students pursuing STEM degrees. The goal is that all students will begin to think scientifically and incorporate STEM practices in the way that they think about everything, whether it's marketing or accounting, or as a lawyer, or as a member of an advanced manufacturing plant. And the core of this quantum leap forward is that NGSS aims to require students to develop creative, evaluative, and analytical skills. So thinking back to the example of the little guy on the dock fishing, casting his line back in the same spot over and over again, had he been a scientific thinker, he had developed those scientific thinking skills, he would have been creating ways of testing or creating solutions to his problem, evaluating the data coming back, no fish, no fish, no fish. Or perhaps he gets a fish. What does that mean? And constantly analyzing that situation. What you see in front of you, this upside-down triangle, is a rearticulation of Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy, which has existed since 1956. So this is nothing new. It's been slightly rearranged. Typically, Bloom's taxonomy has 6 levels, starting at the bottom with the lowest order of thinking, remembering. and then advancing to understanding, applying, then analyzing, evaluating, and creating. Anderson and others in 2000 sort of organized this, and it's a great illustration of how NGSS works to really bring creating, evaluating, and analyzing together simultaneously so that students are focused on that higher order thinking, but in a way that's student-centered. Again, being that little guy casting off the dock. That was an experiment in action if he was acting as a scientist, trying to answer the question of why am I not getting any fish here. In order to solve that problem of no fish, he'd need to be analyzing, evaluating, and creating simultaneously. And so as a STEM educator or as a professional or as a coach that is involved in coaching a team, whether it's junior first LEGO League or first LEGO League, your students, your children in that group need to be developing these skills, or at least taking the skills from the classroom and applying them and taking them deeper in accomplishing the goals of their challenge, because they may not be necessarily solving an overarching question. They're solving a problem in an engineering design challenge. How are the standards changing? Now students are really learning to be scientists and engineers. The standards are now performance expectations, and I want to just mention that a performance expectation means that a student will be able to demonstrate mastery of the underlying skill in any context. For example, if you think about the manual transmission automobile versus an automatic transmission automobile, driving requires a certain skill set. You need to know the rules of the road, when to brake, when to accelerate, traffic signals, and things like this. An automatic transmission automobile takes care of all of the shifting for you. In a manual transmission automobile, you also need, on top of all of the rules of the road, you need the understanding of how to shift through the gears appropriately. So while you may be able to drive, if you can't shift appropriately through the gears in any particular context, you haven't met the performance expectation. You wouldn't pass your driver's test in a manual transmission automobile. In the case of STEM standards, the next generation science standards are performance expectations. So the skills and knowledge that is acquired through instruction is going to have to be performed on an assessment. And so kids are going to be put through their paces, applying those skills in an unfamiliar context. And if you come from a state with inquiry standards, you've probably already seen this. NECAP, the New England Common Assessment Program, the Regents, there's a number of different assessments that integrate inquiry standards and do some of this already. Focusing instruction on how science and technology is developed is another core focus, as well as breaking that down into the 3 dimensions, 2 of which will be new to most states. So let's take a look at those a little closer. It's important to note that the 3 dimensions of NGSS exist because science, technology, engineering, and math are living, breathing things. They're more than facts and processes, and the NGSS aims to point out and teach students how those 3 dimensions interrelate and how STEM is multidimensional and interrelates even between science, technology, engineering, and math. Looking a little closer at dimension 1, which is STEM practices, this is new to most states. Some states with the inquiry standards will be familiar with some aspects of the practices, but the underlying words here on the slide are a departure from typical STEM instruction, because students, and that's really key here, students are the ones who are asking. They're the ones developing. They're the ones planning. When students are engaged in this first dimension, STEM practices, they're being scientists and engineer, and they're also developing those higher order thinking skills that we saw at the top of the upside down triangle a moment ago. evaluating, analyzing, and creating. So this is in contrast to some models where students are given something, but they will have to follow it, given a procedure, not actually developing it. And just taking a quick look here, we have a few questions coming in, and those questions, we are going to be taking them, but we're going to be taking the questions towards the end of the session, so just bear with us. Given that this first dimension of STEM practices requires asking, developing, planning, from your perspective as a teacher or as a coach, what do you need to ask yourself? And concretely, what does it mean for you and your team or your classroom? So taking a look at this list, ask yourself, are the students required to, and then go right down. So for instance, number 2, develop their own model. Ask yourself, are students following a procedure you've given them, or are the students developing their own procedure or program? Are they keeping the hypothesis, the question, the problem in focus? Are they the ones analyzing and interpreting? And so your role then switches to asking the questions and slowing the group or pivoting the group to really focus intentionally so that students are required to intentionally work through each of these practices and develop that skill. If you do it for them, they aren't practicing the skill. Really important. Dimension 2, disciplinary core ideas. Disciplinary core ideas are what all states have traditionally focused on. They are the fact basis of STEM that we often refer to as content. Engineering, technology, and the application of science will be new to a number of states. So it's essentially something that's been kind of added in there from what's traditional. But this is the content, the facts, the sedimentary, igneous, metamorphic rock, sedimentation process. Those sort of things fall within the 4 domains, content domains. Within each domain, the content is now more broadly relevant. That's important because depending on what state you come from, the content standards can be very granular, and they can essentially be so fact-focused that it's an individual fact that's not particularly relevant to anything else other than one specific instance. And for example, Earth and Life Science now focuses more on climate change and genetics versus some of the maybe finer points of rocks and minerals and having to memorize specific rocks' properties. With each disciplinary core idea, it's important to maintain an intentional focus. So this is, again, the second dimension. For example, adaptations are a key organizing concept that links earth science, life science, physical science, and engineering. So a question to ask yourself is, are you considering how a changing climate affects adaptations in a future population and the survival of a species? If you aren't, when it comes to dealing with genetics or inheritance or evolution of a population, you're missing out. So it's important to attempt to understand and solve the complex interactions, not necessarily that you're coming up with brand new science, but as a group you're thinking about or encouraging students to develop the habit of mind of thinking about the complex relationships between different concepts. That brings us to the third dimension, cross-cutting concepts. So cross-cutting concepts are a way of linking the different content domains from disciplinary core ideas that we just talked about to their system behavior, or sort of grouping them according to their system behavior. These are the 7 high-level system behaviors that the next generation science standards focus on. If you've heard of systems thinking or system dynamics, these concepts are very closely related, and some of them actually, if you've read any of like Peter Senge's books, actually are reflected there as well. What I like to ask myself is, can students relate and organize specific aspects of one system's behavior to another system from a different domain. So, for example, how do rocks, water, and living organisms behave similarly over time? This gets at the idea that living and non-living things follow predictable patterns, and also in this case, it's cycles which conserve energy and matter. So you have actually multiple systems interacting. NGSS takes Common Core ELA and math alignment into consideration. That's, I guess, one of the benefits of being sort of the third tier, ELA, math, science. Once Common Core ELA and math standards were published, NGSS was just sort of getting into development and out there. So Common Core and math, Common Core ELA and math were implemented, were published, and so NGSS has actually linked with each performance expectation Common Core ELA and math standards that relate. So you can actually see that in the documentation itself. Important to note is English and math skills are extensively used in STEM under NGSS, and so they're reflected in the documentation, but also in the methodology, the way that science and engineering needs to be taught. It's not taught, again, as facts in isolation or demonstrations in isolation. It's taught as an environment where students are able to be scientists and engineers. The nice thing is that NGSS is also helping educators achieve the goals of Common Core ELA and math, and so that's what we've broken out for you here a little bit. Within Common Core ELA, the purpose of every scientific experiment is to arrive at a conclusion and communicate that conclusion even if it's inconclusive. And so this requires technical, precise, and really well-supported analysis. The example that's shown on the screen right now is from the K through 5 bracket, which if you are a junior first LEGO League or first LEGO League coach, these standards would apply to your kids. And if you're a middle school educator, these are the standards that come right before your kids. So it's important to see this is where the kids are coming from, even at a kindergarten level. So this example shows how the skills are developed, right down to conveying complex ideas, information clearly and accurately through the effective selection, organization, and analysis of content. That is a scientific conclusion in a nutshell. Common Core Math is a little different. So just backing up for 1 second, Common Core ELA has a whole separate sort of section that talks about technical writing, scientific writing. When it comes to Common Core Math actually lays out math practices, and those math practices overlap significantly with STEM practices. The STEM practices come from that first dimension that we talked about, those 8 STEM practices. Well, look at here. There are 8 math practices, and students use these math practices every time they collect data. They apply math within the context of their experiments, within their prototyping. If you're programming, if you're part of first, you're programming. If you have a coding curriculum as part of whether it's part of your regular curriculum or after school, math loops, recursive processes, all of these require not only precision and structure, but that abstract reasoning, quantitative analysis, and problem solving. Students also need to find key data to support a claim about their hypothesis, and the Common Core Math practices are essentially trying to accomplish that within the context of math. It's what a word problem is. If any of you have given any word problems out today, you can think about those word problems as requiring math practices and also STEM practices. The NGSS's effect on teaching and assessment. There's 7 key shifts here, and the key takeaway, when standards get at a higher order thinking, it's a quantum leap because the students have greater college and career opportunities. So when you look at these key shifts, and I'll read them off here, keep that in mind. You're creating from beginning in the first grade, and all of the things that we're talking about tonight start in kindergarten or really the first grade when it comes to NGSS and are built upon. So none of these things are grade level specific. What happens is they get reflected in a grade level application, but none of them are grade level specific. So when you look at those dimensions, when you look at those higher order thinking skills, those are as true of first grade as they are of 12th grade, and vice versa. So let's look at these 6 key shifts. Number 1, remembering alone no longer has much value. Will there be multiple choice as part of the next generation assessment? Absolutely, but it's not going to be facts and trivia. Leads us to number 2. The history, facts, and trivia have been set aside. What's important is number 3, that solutions are now derived from a context. So if you think about the context as being a passage from the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times on climate change, there could be 2 graphs presented, and then students could be asked something about the author's opinion based on the data and whether they agree or disagree with it and why, or why do they believe that the author came to this conclusion given the data. So you can see just within that example that a student would need to be obviously using ELA skills, English language skills. They would also need to be able to use math skills. They'd be interpreting graphs, and they'd also they'd be writing. They would also be using their STEM skills because they would have to be thinking using STEM practices. Okay, transitioning to performance-based assessment, and that description that I just gave of an article with graphs. If you've been involved in PARCC assessments, either as a pilot or if your state is already committed to adopting them, that is really the future of next generation science assessments. It's a context. Nobody cares whether John drove a red truck or a blue truck. It's why he drove the truck to the store. Why is it that he drove it that way? That's sort of the basis of the PARCC testing for English language. Now it's why are scientists making this type of decision based on the data, based on the description? Can you think of another possible conclusion given the same data that would be opposite of the conclusion that this group of scientists came to? That's all performance-based, and that requires students to demonstrate that they have developed those STEM practice skills. Number 5, contextualized learning puts new demands on what it means to teach hands-on. Teaching hands-on is no longer good enough to just create something. The fact that students built this, whatever this is, or created this explanation, observed this demonstration, it's not enough. They need to be able to develop a model based on an idea. So starting with a question, starting with a problem. How do you go from that problem to the point where you develop a model? What does that model need to look like? What data does it need to collect? How are you going to use that data to support the validity of the prototype, whether it solves the problem or not? Or in the case of science, whether the hypothesis is supported or not, or is it inconclusive? Those, given a context, a student needs to be able to do that. And with the purpose of forming a conclusion. So we come to number 6. Students need to be able to identify, they need to be able to identify clear proof of their academic claims. And so if they say that their hypothesis was true or was supported, they need to be able to use evidence from their experiment to show exactly how it was true or false or supported or not supported. Number 7, STEM instruction will require ELA and math skills, and I think as you've been reading through the slides and I've been talking, I'm sure you've gotten the sense that if a student is not up to proficiency in ELA practices and processes, or math practices and processes, it's going to be different to rely. It's going to be difficult to rely on those skills to be able to perform what is expected under the next generation science standards. So it goes both ways. NGSS is helpful to ELA and math, but NGSS also relies on ELA and math. So for folks who have English language learners, it's a important consideration in terms of making sure that students are really the center of instruction in that getting that experience. How does things like KnowAtom, Junior First LEGO League, and First LEGO League fit in? And your role as an educator in the classroom or after school, even if it's as a mentor, as a coach, if you consider yourself somehow, if a coach is somehow not an educator, I don't know how that's possible, but you really are filling both roles. You're giving students the opportunity to be scientists and engineers, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. If you kind of look at the screen here, on the left side, you see sort of this is KnowAtom world. We spend all of our days, and we have for the last 8-9 years, developing really the core of curriculum, September through June, 1st grade through 8th grade, that creates the experience in the classroom for students to be that scientist or engineer and develop those STEM skills. And so whatever curriculum you're using, whether it's KnowAtom or another curriculum, the materials and the experiments and the prototypes all fit within what the standards require. And so that takes a good deal of time and a good deal of focus. And so under the next generation science standards, everybody is going through sort of a realignment phase. We're fortunate because the documentation was published initially back in 2010, and we've been working on it since then, that we're a bit ahead of the curve here. But it's important that whatever curriculum and materials are aligned to the standards, as well as the professional development. This is really important because this is not business as it was. It's really very different. In order to create an environment where you see a couple students here working in lab notebooks, 4th grade students developing their prototype, developing their experiment, and they're doing this in the course of a couple days and then moving on to their next prototype, their next experiment, and refining those skills and working in partnerships. That requires a new level of skill for many folks that is achievable, but it's not, it's emerging in terms of professional development support networks, so it's something to kind of keep in mind. On the flip side, these students are getting this experience in the classroom developing STEM skills as scientists and engineers, and they're really turned on about being a scientist or being an engineer, creating prototypes and doing experiments, but then they're kids. So how do they take that to the next level now? And many of these students, we see this year after year, are going out there, joining FIRST programs. Their classrooms are joining, you heard earlier about Toshiba competitions, the Disney Change Your World competition, was it the Toshiba National Science Fair International Science Fair competition, and Siemens competitions, and so on. They're seeking out these opportunities, and so as a FIRST coach, what you can do is you can require the same skills, the same next generation STEM skills of your kids in your team, and actually get them thinking, whether or not it's happening in the classroom, it doesn't even matter. You can get them thinking about these 3 dimensions and putting them to work on the problem that their challenge has laid out for them. And while they're doing the research about learning, or while they are developing the code, or while they're building the physical robots, really making sure that that's all connected to those 3 dimensions, to the STEM practices, to the purpose and the disciplinary core ideas behind it. If they're talking about a search engine and they're talking about loops, why does it look that way? Even if it's an artist's rendering, why was it created that way? Why is it a loop and not a line or a rod? Why is it considered a search engine? Why is a search engine not a physical thing? All of those sort of questions are questions you can ask, and I love the picture of this this young lady here who is just so enthusiastic about what her team is accomplishing with their robot, because to her and to her team, they are professional scientists and engineers, and they didn't wait 15 years for the opportunity to see their ideas come to life. You know, they started it in school and they took it after school, and that's what programs like Junior First LEGO League and First LEGO League make possible, and also they enhance the really the value and the longevity of what we as educators are trying to establish in the classroom. So with that said, I want to turn it over back to Jen here for some question and answer. We had so many slides, and this is a fairly nuanced and complex area of evolution. I want, with Next Generation Science Standards, I want to take some question and answer from the audience, and then also I wanted to let you know that we will be linking to the webinar and making that available via YouTube or some other source in a follow-up email. And on Friday, resources and a recap will be posted on the KnowAtom blog as well. So Jen, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. I just want to take a quick moment because there were a few webinar attendees who were a little bit confused. If you do have a question, please feel free to use the question or chat feature that's in your GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You are all, as attendees, in listen-only mode. So one of the first questions that came in this evening was, what level of discretion do department heads and teachers have with state STEM standards?
Oh, that's a great question. It depends on what state you come from. In general, there is a great deal of discretion. So there are certain states like Texas, Florida, California, and others that are considered adoption states. So from a program level, those adoption states have a state board of education which votes on what textbooks essentially are approved by the state, and that's where you see these news reports of, you know, a fight over some nuance of evolution or something else that kind of hits the media every year. But there's an awful lot of discretion, because at the end of the day, it's up to the educators and the principals at a local level, and superintendents really. It's a local level decision how the state standards are brought to life in a classroom. And there are also, even within adoption states, there are alternative adoption methods as well. So it's really not a major issue.
Great. We also had a question about what research was used in regards to child development for the linear progression of higher order learning skills that are at the core of NextGen.
That's a good question. So the National Academy of Science and Engineering commissioned the National Research Council to basically collect the academic research, and there is a whole guide that you can find if you go to the oh my goodness, it's like the Harvard Review of the National Science Foundation, but we'll post that resource for you. But essentially, there were literal publications of the resources, and also the methods of collecting resources and judging whether they were academic or not academic. But essentially, it was research that was done in actual classrooms that had an academic focus, that had a scientific methodology around it, and was considered to be scientifically valid according to the criteria set forth by the National Research Council.
We also have a question, why don't most middle schools teach STEM?
Well, most middle schools teach science. STEM is, It's a good question. So most middle schools teach science. The thing that has happened is that while middle schools have been teaching science for decades and decades, the prominence of technology, engineering, and math within science has been increasing. And 30 years ago, the internet was unknown to most people. The use of technology and personal devices, iPhones, for instance, smartphones, none of this existed. So essentially what happened was that the rate of change within technology outpaced the rate of change within education, which is understandable given the process that you have to go through in order to get these sort of federal level initiatives going and then trickle down to the classroom level through all the different channels. But I think the silver lining is that more and more middle school classrooms are teaching STEM, and the important thing is that we realize that science, technology, engineering, and math don't exist independently, and actually that STEM in and of itself is not even independent, that it's actually all about education, it's all about learning, and that science, technology, engineering, and math require ELA skills, they require history and social studies skills. And so, so by bringing the technology, engineering, and math into middle school science classes, we're giving students a better sense of what the world is about, really.
How will STEM use collaborative skills across disciplines and teams to teach design, planning, and evaluation skills?
How will STEM use collaborative skills across disciplines and teams to teach design, plan, and evaluate skills? Trying to, I guess, essentially, what it's doing is it's requiring students to learn in context. So similar to the way that a first Lego challenge requires students to rise to the challenge, consider the challenge, consider the problems that they need to solve, and actually go about solving them, they have to design and plan a solution and evaluate it. And so they are going to enter with a certain skill set, and by exercising it, they're going to refine those design, planning, and evaluation skills to a point where they become proficient or even exemplary, and within the context of creating whatever prototype, or within the context of a classroom that uses KnowAtom, or another science curriculum where you might be approaching a question or a problem, practicing those STEM practices and those higher order thinking skills is what requires collaboration as well as use of the skills.
We have a question regarding when will next generation science standards go into effect, and what is the plan to transition into the current curriculum?
It depends on your state. So there are a number of states where these are either already in effect or they will be in effect a year from now. So states are continuing to onboard monthly or certainly quarterly. I'm sorry, the second part of the question, though? Jen, do you mind to repeat the question again? I just wanted to get the second part of that question.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry that we've got a number of questions coming in, so I'm just looking for it again in the queue. I believe that it was in regards to the transition plan.
Oh, sure. The transition plans. the devil's in the details, and the transition plans really vary. What's happening is most states are signaling their intent to adopt, and then they're giving folks like yourselves time to consider what adoption means, seek out resources like this webinar, like Next Generation Science Standards, Achieve website, state-level specific websites, and kind of get up to speed. Unfortunately, where it breaks down a bit is how states, and each state is different, how states communicate with their sort of city and town level leadership, and then how that town and level leadership communicates with the principals. That's the devil in the details. So these professional development opportunities, is what we call them, are not necessarily the most widely published. So what tends to happen is that a state will not only signal their intent to adopt and the timeline, they then will email superintendents or school boards and/or school boards. Then what they will do is set up like a seminar as well as webinars. Folks will be invited to that within the district at an administrative level, and then those administrators will be responsible for bringing that information back to the teachers. Sometimes there are teacher level workshops, webinars like this, but not as many as perhaps there could be. So I think that whole transitioning is a work in progress right now. The really big question that's looming around the transition is, once these standards are adopted, what will be the state level assessments for Next Generation Science Standards? And that has not emerged. There's been some sort of a lot of talk about what it's going to be, and some sort of finger pointing at different examples of what it might look like, such as the ones I described earlier, but there's no official Next Generation Science assessment yet. So once a standard goes into play in a district, because it's law, it then needs to be assessed, and so that's again why people are giving a little bit more time. One other thing that's important to point out in the transition is that many states who do not officially adopt Next Generation Science Standards are taking the Next Generation Science Standards, kind of morphing them a little bit, maybe adding a couple standards of their own, taking a couple away, and calling them their own science standards. So, you know, Massachusetts has actually done that a little bit. So Massachusetts is going to have a Next Generation Science Standards, the next generation of Massachusetts Science Standards, but they are not going to be called the Next Generation Science Standards because they've been kind of tweaked a little bit. There are benefits to that. You can imagine if you're in a state that has adopted Common Core, with a lot of the news around Common Core, that news affects everybody. So not being a Common Core state is a good thing. From a resource perspective, it makes it a little more difficult on states that customize, because all of the resources are now moving towards Next Generation Science Standards, like KnowAtom has. And so for states that remove things from Next Generation Science Standards or add things in, it's going to be harder for them to find resources that are not entirely teacher created or district created. So that's a challenge. So what's our next question there, Jen?
Sure. Do you have any strategies to suggest for getting middle school students to engage in metacognition activities, getting them to think about their own thinking?
Sure. Socratic dialogue is the best. Essentially asking students about their thinking. So if a student, if you're approaching a challenge, a problem, let's say, and a student wants to just start building, you ask them, well, why are you building what you're building? You know, why are you building it this way? And the student says, well, because we need to make a robot. We're like, well, what does your robot need to do? And then they start to articulate for you, well, the robot needs to be able to pick up the loop. And you say, okay, well, can the robot you're building pick up a loop? How would it do that? And so by asking a series of questions, what you're doing is you're putting it back on the student to then demonstrate the thinking. And so by demonstrating the thinking, they actually begin thinking about their thinking. And so that's that metacognitive of skill. And so what's also kind of interesting is that students, especially working hands-on in a great challenge like you would have in Junior First LEGO League or First LEGO League, or with a KnowAtom experiment or prototype in the classroom, the students want to be the scientist, they want to be the engineer, and they really want to bring their ideas to life. They don't want to have to ask you questions. So once they get in the habit of when you see something, you ask them a question and they answer it, their thinking becomes more kind of metacognitive in nature. They say, I don't need to ask the question, or I can get to a better result faster by using that thinking skill that's sort of been modeled for me by the Socratic dialogue from my coach or my teacher. And that's very, very effective, especially in a hands-on context. Oops.
Francis, we are coming up to the end of our hour, and we still have a few questions to get through. So I just want to be respectful of time, of your time and both your time and the attendees' time. So I'm just wondering how many more questions you think you want to address before we.
Sure. How many questions do you think we have?
I don't think we have enough to get through all of them, but
Sure.
I can. I'd suggest maybe we try to address at least 2 or 3 more if you have the time.
Sure. Let's say I have another 15 minutes, and then if people need to leave now, I certainly understand that. But I'll stay up to another 15 minutes, so we can answer the questions you have there.
Great, that sounds great. We have a question that asks, it looks like the STEM approach gives lots of freedom to teachers and no textbooks. As a parent, how can we know and emphasize the concepts at home?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So, well, one thing is that the standards are available to everyone. They're not something you have to pay for. They're not something that is under lock and key. So the next generation science standards, and even if you're not a next generation state, your state standards are available online. All you have to do is Google your state's name and science standards. Sometimes adding frameworks in there is helpful. The next generation science standards have an entire website devoted to all the documentation and understanding it, so they're particularly well documented. In terms of reinforcing at home and understanding what you can do to sort of build on what's going on in the classroom again at home, what I would say is to look back at the 3 dimensions and also those higher order thinking skills. At home, anything you do with your student should, if you're doing it from a STEM learning perspective, even if you're going to the museum, let's use the museum as an example. I go to museums, and it's a very interesting experience because oftentimes the museum is crowded. It's a rainy day, and folks are going around, and they're looking at all the exhibits and pushing all the buttons, but what they're not doing is they're not asking the questions of their child. Why, we're pushing this button. Why is the model lighting up? Why is that metal plate flying into the air? This is an exhibit on magnetism. What do we know about magnets? If we've learned something about magnets at school, what have we learned about it? And then we can talk about north and south and attracting and repelling. And so instead of just pushing the button and seeing the kind of fantastic exhibit, which has value, absolutely, it goes to a deeper level. And those 3 dimensions you can glean just from this PowerPoint and from this presentation. You can see it in pages and pages of granularity within the standards themselves. The idea that a textbook is really a false sense of security, and I think that I hope if you take anything away from this, that's among the top. The textbooks are really, when you look at a textbook is really written traditionally. There's a vocabulary word, there's a picture associated to it, and then the vocabulary word is explained within a very small paragraph, and then you go to the next paragraph, new vocabulary word, that paragraph explains that vocabulary word. And that's sort of the model. There's not necessarily a narrative of explaining the overarching concept. And so a textbook can really be a false sense of security. And the way that we approach nonfiction reading, so from a curriculum perspective in the classroom, KnowAtom approaches it as nonfiction reading is a narrative that explains a concept, and then there's a Socratic dialogue that builds off of that concept, and so you have that shared common experience. So at home, you're trying to take the classroom experience and share it. And then you go on to some sort of prototyping or experimenting process and debrief. So that could even be experimenting and prototyping at home as a way of making it a little bit deeper. Sorry, next question there.
No, that was great. I do want to come back to our participant who was asking about transition. There was an additional part to that. How will the transition happen? For example, 7th grade students would have a hard time transitioning to new next generation science standards if they had previously done very little science.
Yes, and a rising tide floats all boats, and a receding tide has the opposite effect. And I think the transition process, it's going to be a transition for everyone, and at some point there will be a group of students in 7th grade when new standards come into force, and so those students will be required to get up to speed. The way the transition usually happens is that essentially educators are put in a position where they need to have a lot of discussions with students for the first time ever. And then what happens is as those discussions happened at 6th grade, when that next that 6th grade group next year becomes 7th graders, that discussion doesn't need to happen in 7th grade. We can now have an even deeper discussion, sort of getting that other stuff out of the way in 6th grade. And that's how it happens. And actually, when we implement curriculum, oftentimes, and part of it has to do with the design of what the way we've designed our curriculum, but oftentimes what will happen is that if there's a multi-age, multi-grade classroom, or if people are doing a district-level implementation, that a 7th grade class will do 7th grade curriculum, or will even look at a 6th grade curriculum, building up the same skills in the same 3 dimensions, and then sort of roll into the 7th grade curriculum next year. It's really a question of depth, and so that's what educators are really unbelievably skilled at executing, is really, where is the student at, and then as I'm having this discussion, as we're attempting this experiment or prototype, are the students really getting it? Do I need to throttle back and have another discussion with them, or can I go deeper? And so there is going to be some professional development with some folks, but that's really how the transition happens. In terms of enforcement at a state and local level, it really does come down to each individual state and municipality, because most people sort of will, at a district administrative level, will say, you know what, we have new standards, our data is going to take a little bit of a dip this year, but everybody's is. At a state level, they'll often compensate for that depending on how the data is sort of analyzed and where proficiency levels are set statistically. So it's not, the kids are not at a disadvantage, because they're going to be in 7th grade year when something comes into force. It puts a lot of pressure on educators and administrators to be very thoughtful and intentional about how they implement, because they need to think about, the long game and the short game simultaneously.
I think we might have time for about 2 more questions.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just not sure we'll be able to get through them all. There's quite a few still remaining, but I'm looking for the common threads. If schools were to use STEM, how would students be benefited, and what would the outcome be?
If schools use STEM, what would be the benefit and what would be the outcomes? Well, the benefits of teaching STEM in school is really that students have an understanding of the natural world as well as the human-made world. And the human-made world is engineering and technology. If you think about the room you're in, wherever you are, and you remove everything that was human-made, you're left with probably nothing. Very, very little. And so when you remove the human-made world from a science education, you remove an awful lot. Which is shaping the world that your students live in, and an awful lot that is required for college and career readiness, because the reality is that our knowledge of the natural world is always growing, but it's not growing at the rate that our knowledge of through technology and engineering, our knowledge is growing, and I guess I would say our capabilities are growing. And so it opens a world of opportunity. And it's not that every student has to go to college. It's really advanced manufacturing. The manufacturing that's coming back to the United States is advanced manufacturing. These are not jobs where folks have to, dad leaves the floor and has to, change the clothes, and they're all oily, and they, that side of the thing. These are clean rooms. Folks with certifications, 1-year degrees, 2-year degrees, and even just a high school diploma doing assembly work. Those jobs require STEM skills. So absolutely teaching STEM opens a world to the students in terms of knowledge, makes them informed citizens, but the outcome is really that they have better future opportunities.
Excellent. We also have a question about private industry. How can private industry participate in the development and implementation of STEM planning?
Private industry can play a major role. We recently partnered with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts through Race to the Top funding and a grant for a program called STEM Squared. You can Google that or go to stemsquared.org. Just spell it right out, STEM squared.org, no punctuation in there, just the .org. Private industry they're the ones who are relying, their lifeline is a STEM educated workforce. And today's students are tomorrow's innovators in STEM industry. And so what you can do is really to connect with educators in districts in your community or even at a higher level if you can, and help educators and STEM coaches like FIRST coaches understand that these jobs in your place of work require STEM skills, and the STEM skills that are required to be in finance or to be in marketing or to be in manufacturing or to be, whatever it is within your firm, requires STEM skills but doesn't require a PhD, doesn't necessarily require a PhD, doesn't necessarily require a master's, and help them get an opportunity to understand that STEM is really for all students and that the skills are creating opportunities for all students, because the whole discussion around STEM is a relatively new thing. That there's a natural question within everybody's mind, I think, that why is it that if 2% or 3% of the population become STEM professionals with a STEM degree, that 100% of the population should be sort of inflicted with a STEM education in K-12. And the reality is that, well, that 2 or 3% have STEM degrees and PhDs or masters and work at a particular STEM place. The reality is that at that same STEM industry site, there are many, many more individuals who do not have masters and doctorates that are using the skills that are being taught in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, all the way on up. And even at the level of understanding practices and processes, why they are important for manufacturing, why they are important for quality control. It all comes back to STEM, and those are things that we did through STEMsquared.org. We engaged over 80 communities in Massachusetts. We took them into 4 STEM industry sites. We took these were elementary educators. They went into a former Vigeant semiconductor, which is now owned by Applied Materials in Gloucester, Massachusetts. We went to Abiomed, which was started with the first artificial heart and is now into restorative heart devices. We took them into Analogic, which is responsible for many of the analog to digital converters, specifically around CAT scans, MRIs, and ultrasounds. And also, there was a third one here, Excelis Technologies, which looks is another semiconductor company. So the purpose of this whole thing was not to take educators in to make them scientists and engineers, but to take them in and to help them understand that there are real jobs, that they are at all different levels, and that the skills start early, they start in their classroom, and that through the next generation science standards and similar standards, that there are things that educators can do now in first grade that are opening those doors. And it really, it's key to demystifying STEM. It's a very, very important partnership. On the other side, what you can do is help contribute to programs that achieve the goals of the next generation science standards. Programs like FIRST, even programs like KnowAtom. GE was a big part of our beginnings early on. But there's many others, and that gives educators the tools to actually achieve these goals. That's one of the other things when it comes to transitions and implementation. One of the unfortunate things is that most districts do not budget significantly for science or for STEM. And that's an issue, because if you look at any major university or institution, when you look at how money is spent or what money is spent, a lot of money goes to the sciences. Significantly fewer dollars go towards sort of the humanities, and it's because of what's involved. The equipment, the materials, the training, and so on. And so that's another way that you can help. But it's very important to make that teacher connection, because you have to remember all student learning happens with a student. And so it's the people who interact with the students, the teachers, the coaches, the principals, and even parents. Those are the folks that really need the awareness and the resources. How are we doing, Jen? Any other questions there? Or?
I do believe so, but we're about 15 minutes past the hour at this point. So I do think that to be respectful of time, we probably should wrap up. I can give you one more that actually has a couple of levels to it, and then I'd suggest maybe we find some other way to get in touch with the participants who got outstanding questions.
Sure, we'd be happy to do with that.
Great. We've got a couple layers of questions that are about what these STEM programs might look like. Would teamwork and collaboration be in emphasis in STEM programs at different grade levels? And would you anticipate that STEM development projects like robotics and med tech be related to current trends in the industry?
That is a multi-level question. So would you mind to repeat it one more time?
Sure. Would teamwork and collaboration be emphasized in STEM programs at all grade levels, and would STEM development projects like robotics and med tech be related to current trends in the industry?
Yes, I mean, well, teamwork and collaboration are important. In terms of their emphasis in the standards themselves, I would say it's implied. There's not, I mean, trends in the industry, I guess, is really the thing to focus on here. The way that next generation science standards come to life is really in a team environment in the classroom, and that means collaboration with peers. It's not students collaborating one-on-one with their teacher as much as one-on-one with their peer and then checking in with their teacher. That reflects the model that most industry is, at least sort of cutting-edge industry, is moving towards, if they're not already there, where really there are small groups of people, teams, with different but complementary skill sets, all approaching a problem or a question with their unique skills to come up with a result. And I recently spoke with a chief technical officer, or a chief marketing officer actually, and he was really talking about how he doesn't even like to hire people who like to come to him for approvals for anything. What he is certainly out of the gate. He said, what I want to do is when somebody comes to me for an approval for funding or for something like that, he's like, I want them to come to me with for approval of something they've already tried. And so, with certain contexts, whether if there's a regulatory constraint, certainly, you maybe can't do that. But in most cases, that's the trend in the industry, STEM related, that individuals are expected to be A/B testing or at least piloting before they really, kind of go to the next level within management or others for approval. So that collaborative skill that can be fostered through after-school or in-school teams and collaboration is certainly a trend in the industry, but I think it will be a trend in how people implement the NGSS.
Right, well, Francis, I want to thank you so much for your presentation today, and on behalf of the attendees as well. We did record this webinar presentation, and I'm sure we'll use multiple avenues to post it and make it available to participants.
Wonderful. And we'll take a look at the questions, and those that we can address on our blog we'll address, and if you've tweeted any of them to KnowAtom, we will do our best to answer those where we can as well.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.